So I'm Adam Taggart, I'm Chris's business partner. We talk almost every week with Mike. Chris and Mish do an unscripted discussion of what's been going on in the world since their previous discussion. I think you'll find these guys are very facile and bouncing ideas back and forth. I do want to make sure that we only get a chance to ask 2 questions before we just broke into these smaller groups. So if anybody has a question related to what Chris said, raise your hand, or Mike, we'll start with yours.
Yeah, I actually had a question. And by the way, Chris and I do this 2 to 3 times a month, and it's over the phone. So here we're just going to have essentially the same conversation that we would have in a podcast over the phone. But and we've talked about this before. But where does what happens if we get cold fusion? What if that works? Is that ever likely to work? NASA's looking into that right now, and certainly that would change your model if we have all this free energy out there. But is this likely? In what time frame? Why or why not?
Well, so is everybody familiar with cold fusion as an idea? It actually goes by the name low energy nuclear reactions right now. There's a lot of scientists have found, including NASA scientists, have found some anomalous behaviors when they take hydrogen, particularly deuterated hydrogen, and run it across nickel or palladium beds. And one of the reasons I might buy palladium, by the way. And it creates some excess heat. Now, let's presume that tonight we perfect it. And what has to happen next is we have to manufacture this and get this out at scale. So there'll be millions, if not billions, of these little units that will have to be created. We'll have to figure out a lot about scaling that up, what the risks are. It just takes a lot of time to really go into that. But even if we did this, what these things create is excess heat, which is fine. You can use a Stirling engine and turn it into electricity. There's a variety of ways you can turn this into mechanical energy, but more on the steam engine side of things. What they won't do is create liquid fuels for us at this point in time. So we talk about petroleum because it put it in our cars and it gives us air travel and things like that. But it's also used in over 500,000 compounds. 30% of all petroleum goes into industrial processes, not transportation. The petroleum itself is really actually an extraordinarily valuable substance. And until we figure out how to go from something that makes excess heat and turn that into liquids, which we could, but it's going to take a really long time. And so every time I've looked at a new process, people send me this stuff all the time. Like, here's a scientist who's created a beaker of this oil, right? And I get all the news reports. Invariably, I have to write back and go, okay, they've created one beaker, probably at about $50,000 a barrel, being honest about it. But the idea is that they'd be able to scale that up. So if you go into pilot plant manufacturing people and people who are in actual manufacturing processes, they say, great. They have some process. It operates at this scale. We're going to first take it to a demonstration plant. We're trying to make 10 barrels a day. And we're going to have some learning. About 50% of all ironclad bench processes break down and just don't pass that first barrier. But then we got at the 10 barrel stage. Now we're going to take it to a pilot plant. We're going to see if we can do 100, maybe 1,000 barrels a day. So we're going to scale that up. Again, learnings always happen. Mixing at volume doesn't happen. Catalysts don't work. Who knows, right? And again, there's a 50% breakdown from those 2 processes. What we care about is commercial operation, 100,000 barrels per day or larger. That's where things really, have their biggest challenge to make that jump. So Khosla Ventures, very, very big on algae fuels, biodiesel fuels. Dropped that as a concept because they got stuck at that first stage just trying to get to the pilot plant. The economics didn't work out. Very clever people, good capitalization, did a lot that they could. Not that it won't work, but it's going to probably be decades to scale these up across the levels that we have to do.
Okay, so let's assume a different tag. Let's assume that this doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen for 30 years, or 20 years. Now, the implied level of growth that everyone seems to believe, and you and I don't believe it, but most of the economists that we read say that China's going to grow. Well, China's going to slow a little bit. They say, well, it's not going to have 10% growth. It's only going to have 7% growth for the next year. So China's going to have 7% growth. What is that going to do to their demand for oil if this assumption holds true, which you and I think it can't? And, what's that about the competition for the U.S. military that needs all of this extra oil, and U.S. automobiles that need all this extra oil, And even with Europe being a demographic basket case, it's going to flatline, let's assume. Are the growth assumptions remotely possible that are built in?
No. They're not, because, so we heard it.
And to be clear, you're asking economic growth.
Yes.
Yes.
So we heard the interesting statistic before, which was that China is now the #1 importer of oil in the world. They took that over from the United States late last year. And that's just going to continue. So when you say China has a 7% growth rate, we plug that into our handy rule of 72 or 70, so I can do math. That means they're doubling every 10 years. Full doubling. That means twice as much resources are flowing through their economy in 10 years as currently. And that's been true over the last 10 years or so. Like they've doubled their total energy consumption, which means they're building basically one full coal-fired 1 gigawatt electric plant per week. Right? They have one new one every week going in, and they're going to keep that up for a while. So the idea is, barring a resource war, taking that off the table, we will have to economically compete for the oil that's available. That's why it actually is sitting at over 100 barrel right now. World supplies are actually kind of tight, and they're only going to be tighter if all the world oil majors cut their capital expenditures. There's just going to be slightly less coming out. But China and India are just absolutely increasing their growth. And so people say, well, that's okay, we'll buy it. Some of the best analyses, and Stephen Coppice of Westwood said this, he said the marginal price that people in China are willing to pay for a barrel of oil is very high. They're willing to go to $400 a barrel.
Much higher than the Western world.
Yeah, we have here, if you're driving a 6,000-pound Suburban and you normally would take 4 trips to the store and gas goes to $10 a gallon, you might go, well, which is what $400 a barrel implies. We would go, well, maybe we'll take 2. Like we can dial back our consumption. But in China, if you're on a scooter taking your goods to market, you have a very high willingness to pay in that model. So they're out competing us for oil at this point in time. And they certainly outcompeted Southern Europe, hands down. Right? You look at the demand for oil in Southern Europe, it's just absolutely falling off because they can't afford it. For a lot of reasons, but one, it's too expensive. They would burn more if it was cheaper. And so that's the dynamic that's been in play. And until and unless we see world oil production really increase for some reason, game changer there might be Iraq finally settles down. They could pump a lot more. They are having huge sectarian problems. Companies don't want to invest. They have really crappy oil contracts for majors who have mostly pulled out. Iraq could pump more, but for a variety of political reasons, we're seeing oil production being really held down.
So oil production is down. What's a more realistic growth assumption for China? 2%, 1%, 0%?
It depends what numbers you believe. If we believe the official statistics, that they're going to probably dial back. Eventually, we all end up at the same place, which is 0% growth, because the net energy isn't there. That's the part of the story I didn't have time for today. It doesn't actually matter if we have 100 million barrels coming out of the ground in a year, or 50 million. What matters is how much energy do we have to use to get that energy out of the ground? Because we run our society on surplus energy. I got here because of surplus energy. If the oil industry has to use 100 barrels to find 100 barrels, that's fine, keeps them busy. But there's no barrels left over for us, right? So what we're noticing is that in the old days, when we had the Spindletop find or the Gawar field in Saudi Arabia, about 1,000 feet down, one straw, maybe 30,000 barrels a day if you're lucky came out of a single well, and that well would produce for decades. Now we drill down in the Bakken 10,000 feet, tip it sideways, drill across another 10,000 feet, do a 25-stage multi-frac. The barrels, this will float maybe 1,000 barrels per day for the first month. Within a year, it's only flowing at 300 barrels. Within 3 years, it's producing maybe 5 to 10%. So there's these horrific decline rates. And so we wash, rinse, repeat, and we're getting more and more and more, but we're drilling these constant 20,000-foot wells and just racing through the landscape as we do that. And so in this story, I don't see that there's any way to realistically grow oil production in a really useful way in the worldwide, but most importantly, we get less net energy out of it. And when it's great that Devon and Chesapeake have like thousands of people working and drilling these big, giant, very complex, very technological, beautiful engineering, doing all that work, but it means there's less energy coming out of that operation that we use however we want. We run our society on surplus energy, and complex systems require surplus energy, period. Like, I'm a complex system, so if I suddenly don't have enough calories to maintain myself, I'll start losing weight. If that goes on long enough, my systems begin to shut down. Right? People who climb mountains know this exquisitely. Right? Your food tells you how high up the mountain you can go. Once you run out of food, things begin to shut down. And so that's the analogy. It's our economy is a living system. It needs high flow rates of energy to maintain its complexity. And if it doesn't get that, it starts to simplify. And that's a coded word for possible disruptions. But the thing I'm positive of is that the old model where we said we can have 8% growth in our credit markets and then make all these assumptions about what assets are worth, what stocks are worth, what bonds are worth, all of those are true if and only if we have future growth to make, like why would I loan the government money 30 years at 3.5%? Because I'm pretty sure in 30 years that money will have some value, right? But what if we go 30 years out and there's really not, there's lots of people cashing their bonds in, just like me. There's not really anything to buy. The only reason I'm willing to give that money to the government for 30 years is that I have confidence that in 30 years the future is going to be bigger than the present. Period. If the future isn't bigger, those bonds aren't worth what they're worth today. They have to be priced differently.
There are times when risk taking is appropriate.
Solar.
Back here for sorry.
I'm always curious when I hear about these trends, and but my reading of history is that things happen very suddenly, and people are always, they don't expect it when it occurs. There have always been people talking about trends, but the lessons of history are that things change rapidly, very quickly, when you least expect it. I mean, even in our personal lives, people talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy as a marker for people and the changes that happened to our political system. You know, in July of 1939, people still went to the cafe in Warsaw. 3 months later, their world was forever changed. So I wonder if you could address what we do, given your trend, what we do to prepare for those shocks that will happen inevitably very, very quickly.
I have a motto. It's I'd rather be a year early than a day late to this story, right? I want to be a year before that Warsaw 39 cafe moment. I don't want to be a day late on that story. Because you're right, what happens in these systems, complex systems, they tend to trundle along as is and then they suddenly change. Right. And those change states are usually very quick, right? The snow builds up on the cornice and then it kind of avalanches all at once. So the two things we know about complex systems, I gave one, is that they owe their complexity to energy. Right. The second is you can't predict them. Right? We can't, like a earthquake fault zone is a highly studied but chaotic system. All we can tell you is if a fault that's supposed to go every 10 years hasn't released in 20 years, the chances of an earthquake happening sooner than later is higher, and for it to be bigger than smaller is higher. But we still don't know. Right. So in this story, what I do with Mish is I'm just cataloging the risks because I can't predict what's going to happen. So I look at 2008 and say that was it. That was a moment. That was like one of those painful moments where we had an economic heart attack and we could have said, time to examine my diet and lifestyle choices, or we can go back to the buffet line. So in this story, our sovereign debt's higher or lower? Higher. We have more derivatives or fewer? Are the too big to fail banks larger or smaller? Right? So I look at all the things that I measure and I say all the things that create risks or pressures on this fault zone are actually higher, not lower than they were. And so I can't predict what's going to happen, but I hold the view to flip my motto around. Things are going to unfold more quickly than most people expect. And everything will be fine until suddenly it changes.
In different ways.
It'll take longer than you imagine, but it'll
in an
unfold quicker
unexpected
than you
place.
expect.
Right now, there's a lot of eyes on Japan. A few years ago, there were like almost no eyes on Japan. Now all of a sudden there's a lot of eyes on Japan, and everyone's so intent on this that I'm now starting to think that the crisis is going to be somewhere else where someone's not looking. And then look what happens. Russia comes along, and now all the eyes are on Russia and Ukraine and what that might mean for the energy picture there. We had the rise of Beppe Grillo in Italy, and no one saw that coming. I mean, long term, I'm actually an optimist. I believe that productivity will eventually, provide all these good things. But there's a caveat. The Fed has to get out of the way first. So, when do we have this crisis at the Fed or at the Bank of England or at the Bank of Japan? that forces a change in behavior from what we see now. That crisis is coming. I guarantee it. And I'm sure you agree. We just can't predict where.
Well, no, and we can note the risks and just see how those are piling up. And I totally agree with other people who said that the Fed's not going to willingly change. They're not going to change. They are now part of and have carefully built over several decades the largest command and control central planning monstrosity that you've ever seen. Right? They are micromanaging. They're like day traders of the economy now. You know, every little wiggle they're like responding to it. You know, rather than setting the macro trends. So I don't think they're gonna. I don't think. I've never seen institutions that once they get their hands on power like that, ever go, oh, that was a bad idea. You know?
The weird thing about it is people are acting now as, my God, what's wrong with the Fed? We don't have enough intervention from the Fed. They're blaming everything that's happening on the free market and lack of regulation. When I look at the system and I say, my God, we have more and more regulation every day, and people are clamoring. They want still more regulation, as if these government bureaucrats and Fed bureaucrats can actually come in and do the right thing, when history proves they're going to be wrong at every turn, and wrong in a major way.
But I understand that people want something to work. You know, one of the best metaphors for this I heard was Charles Eisenstein, a great writer. He said, you know, it's a really bad moment for a culture. You put all your faith in your witch doctors or your shaman, and there's no rains, and so they do their best dance, and the rains don't come, and then the people kill the shamans. Like that, you know, they must have really pissed the gods off. So it's really uncomfortable for a culture when the things that you put your faith in don't work. So fast forward, now our high priests and priestesses of monetary policy are dancing like crazy, doing everything they know, and it's not working. And it's making people really uncomfortable.
Actually, it's just raining for like one guy.
The weird thing is, you know,
just his fields. He's getting
they
on.
claim it's working. I mean, Bernanke's writing a book now. You know,
oh, I know. He'll take his victory lap, but I think he sidled off the stage. He'll take his sidle off the stage lap. But some people are going to turn to that and say, I need something to work. And so they'll put their faith in more authority. Right? Mm-hmm. And that'll happen. And that's one of my concerns in this larger narrative, is that when things really don't start to work, I have faith that some people in my country will want to blame somebody. China. It'll be the Russians. I mean, we'll do that. We've seen when you erode confidence in your currency, you're breaking the prime social contract that we have as isolated individuals. Right? That's our number one agreement we can all have. A $20 bill is worth something. When you erode that trust, things happen. And we saw Hitler rise out of the ashes of the broken currency. And we've had a lot of places where when the currency shatters, you don't always get the best outcome next. People react badly to that, and for good reasons too. Which is one of the reasons that we spend our time saying, if you have all your capital, your financial capital, and that breaks, it's going to be a bad moment. But fortunately, there are other forms of capital that we can build for ourselves that will give us resilience, so that even if money goes away completely, we are going to still be resilient and able to carry on, where other people will be completely devastated by that experience.
And let's elaborate on that a little bit, because it's really to the spirit of your question earlier. And as this is an investment conference, one of the things that we try to do is really ask people to expand your definition of investment. Certainly plenty of things to do in the financial area, but there's this framework that Chris and I have started using that Chris is just beginning to touch on here. But do you want to elaborate just a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's this comes out of the permaculture world. You've certainly heard of double and triple bottom line, where people are trying to account for things besides money sometimes. But the idea is that, you know, financial capital, we all know what that is. There are actually 8 forms of capital. You could break it into 4 or 12, but the model we're using is 8. So another form of capital might be living capital. Right, so this is if you live on in a piece of land where the soil is rich and the plants are healthy and the insects are good and you've got nice abundant water, you've got abundant living capital. And the truth is, you can take financial capital and make it into more living capital. Cultural capital, really important. So we noticed, like when Katrina roared through, New Orleans had weak cultural capital. We saw looting, we saw violence, we saw people have a real hard time, we saw people fold up shop and wait for help. There was no resilience in their cultural capital. Japan, March 2011, most devastating thing you could possibly imagine, no looting, people were sharing stuff with each other, they helped each other out, they had a lot of cultural capital. So we can start to understand that there are these different forms of capital, and if you can start to build those out, So social capital is another one. My wife is the expert at that, but we have pretty deep social capital where I live, which I measure by how many people can I call right now to go take care of my chickens or to pick my kids up from somewhere. That's how I measure it. Intellectual capital, we're all highly skilled with that. We've got that. But experiential capital is really essential. And something that I'm working very hard that my kids get, which means I let them make mistakes and go and do stuff, because without experience in something, you have intellectual capital has a hard time being put to use. And so understanding how we can build our capital in these other areas is really an essential piece. And a lot of times when people come with a direct question like, how can I invest locally? Like we heard that from Steen on the first day, which was investing locally in the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises. Hard work. Like, how would you do that, right? Well, that's taking your financial capital and trying to figure out how to build up these other forms of capital, in some cases in your community, while hopefully getting a financial return. People say, oh, I don't like the police state, I might go to Costa Rica. I get this a lot. I say, well, until you understand what the cultural capital is in Costa Rica, I wouldn't even begin to think about doing that. You're flying blind. It's not about bringing your financial capital down there and it's all going to work out. Right? So this is just a framework for starting to understand that we can build these things up actively. It takes active thought. It's not easy work in many cases, and you can't buy it in many cases, and it always takes time.
On the other hand, equities have so much more risk. It actually takes.
Did you have a question?
Yes. Address, please, solar and wind.
You know what?
Solar and wind? Well, which solar? So
We're
solar,
talking about energy.
photovoltaics, though?
That or the mirrors that
Still, yeah. So what we care about is that energy return on energy invested. And we actually have one study now that's been done so we can answer for solar what that is. Because Spain did both the mirrors and huge arrays. And there's enough capital and experience that we can measure how much energy went into that, enough years of returns, and it's one of the sunniest places. Like, this is a great place to do solar. And the answer has an energy return on energy invested of about 2.4. And it takes at least 5, we think, to run a society. So if we wanted to put ourselves solely into solar, and we don't know if we can yet, because what we don't have is a closed loop where we took solar energy, built the trucks that mined the next batch of ore, that brought it to the factory built completely out of electricity, that then completely only using electricity made the new solar panels, and we installed them with workers who were only fed on food that was grown using electricity. Right? We don't have that loop yet. So we don't know if we can do that, but the idea that solar is going to be this thing we're going to seamlessly transition to, we're going to live in this new alternative energy future. Humans have always gone from lower to a higher density fuel. Wood, about this much, is equal to about this much coal, which is equal to about this much oil. Right, which is equal to about this much nuclear, right? So we've always been going to more energy dense. Well, when we want to make that next jump from oil back to solar, it's really diffuse. We've never gone down the curve of energy to a less dense. Not to say we can't, but one prediction I would have is that the amount of capital and effort and expenditure required means it's going to be enormous. So it won't be as seamless as like, we went from coal to oil, that was awesome, and so we're going to go from oil to solar, and that should be just as awesome. It'll be a different process, and one we've never managed before, so we ought to have some latitude for the idea that it's probably going to be more expensive. We'll have some learnings, might not go exactly according to plan.
What's the challenge?
And wind is kind of in the same boat. I think it has a higher return.
I have just a mixed up question that we'll take here. So a couple of years ago, you two famously had a little bit of a back and forth in your blogs on the whole inflation-deflation debate, which amazingly is still an actively debated discussion. No one's definitively answered it. We've had a number of people here at the conference basically say, if I had to intuit a consensus of the speakers so far, it's we're probably going to have some near-term deflationary event, and then maybe, depending on central bankers' response or whatnot, be off to the inflationary races. I'm just curious. It's been a couple of years. Where are your guys' heads now?
My picture hasn't changed. I think we're going to go in and out periods of inflation. But once again, this is all back to how do you define it. If you look at this from a monetary aspect, what's the Fed going to do? We're not going to have deflation for decades. But if you look at it as a destruction of credit, I think another wave is coming down here. You know, look at the junk bond market. You know, what happens if that thing, you know, turns? If companies start going out of business? If there's another downturn in housing, which I think, and I'm going to talk about it in my speech in just a few minutes, why another downturn in housing is going to happen. Well, you know, what's that going to do? What happens? Stephanie had that excellent chart up there, and it's one I've looked at many, many times. I hadn't looked at it lately. So my God, look at this. Look at how banks are decreasing, you know, the amount of loan loss reserves, just at a time when I think they're going to need to go the other way. You know, what happens if the market, in spite of whatever the FASB wrote, what happens if the market says, you know what, we're going to start pricing this stuff, we're going to start marking this stuff to market, whether the banks do it or not. And that's just a change in sentiment. So these are the kinds of things. You know, those are the deflationary forces. Demographics is hugely deflation. Productivity. I think, my God, I did a post the other day that I looked at this technology and it just absolutely shocked me. They're 3D printing houses. I posted this on my blog. They've got this new, you know, cement compound. It's quick drying. They can track layer on layer, just piling up concrete, and it's drying. By the time the thing comes back around, this is dry enough to lay there. So now we don't have to have houses that are square shaped anymore. We can do all kinds of creative things. So we're not going to have the, you know, what 1960s model of track home that went up in the subdivision and they all had to be destroyed a little bit later. These things, and how many people is it going to take to build a house?
Meaning job displacement?
Yes, job displacement. You know, yet the Fed is hell-bent on forcing prices up. They said, my God, we can't live with deflation. Well, the Fed's out trying to protect banks, the value of the assets on the banks, and so they're fueling all of this money in there. You know, in this parabolic growth that Chris and I, we don't know where it ends. We just know that it can't go on like this. And I've had similar conversations with Steve Keen, you know, one of Australia's top economists. You know, I posted a chart, and it's just a chart of 2% inflation. Well, you know, Bernanke says he wants 2% inflation. Look, it's just exponential by definition. You know, at what point is 2% not even possible anymore? I think we're there right now because that's what the world is saying. You know, inflation in Europe in terms of prices on consumer. Spain's in deflation. Italy's in deflation in terms of prices. And what was weird to me was one of the top politicians, I can't remember, in Spain came out and said, you know, wait a second. What's so bad about deflation? I was actually shocked to hear a politician say that Spain's actually now competing with France because the labor costs in Spain have dropped to the point where French firms are bringing in these Spanish workers, and the French unions are in shock over this. But it's what needs to happen. So prices need to come down. The cost of education can't keep going up the way it is. So it's going to come down. So these are the competing forces, and at some point it's going to blow up. You know, with what the Fed is doing. And I wish I could tell anyone what point that was or is, but I can't.
So for you, when you say blow up, just to clarify, do you mean blow up in a deflationary spiral, or
a currency crisis? A currency crisis.
That's more hyperinflation.
Well, yes, but not in the U.S. I don't think this is going to. You know, everyone's looking at what the U.S. is doing, and they're forgetting what China is doing. They're forgetting, you know, what Japan is doing, and they're forgetting about the impossibility of all of this debt being paid back. Well, if it can't be paid back, that to me is deflation. Well, what happens after that? You know, Steen was on. He thinks that there's going to be this inflationary event. It's like, 9 months off. I'm sitting there thinking, well, is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it a decade? I don't know, but I'm willing to bet that it's not 9 months.
Well, I'm going to let you chime in because we got the 2-minute warning. So we've heard where Mike is on this. Where are you these days?
The question was inflation or deflation?
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Are you
One
still
scoop
thinking
of
that?
each.
Yeah.
Well,
are you thinking in deflation first, then inflation, or just?
Well, we're seeing them both right now, and so this is always an interesting debate because the definitions are where we get tripped up. It's always marketed to us as if it's prices, right? So they track the CPI, which is just a basket of goods and services, and then they go, look, we're either having inflation or deflation, as if that mattered. Let me be clear. The Federal Reserve couldn't care less whether your tuition is twice as much next year as this year. They couldn't care less whether your car goes up or down in price. Prices are a symptom. The cause of inflation is always whether you have more credit and money in the system or less. So the theory is that if you have plenty of money and credit, you should generally see rising prices, right? And that's the whole idea. The theory is completely flawed at this point in time because I think they're stuck in the 70s. We had inflation, but we had wages and prices in a spiral. Wages are like a non-show in this particular story. That's part one. And part two is we actually have lots of inflation, but you got to know where to look. The Bank of New Zealand, their governor, who I really admire, says that asset price inflation is inflation. But we back out inflation from GDP because we say that's not real, right? We want to find out what's real in this story. Well, if you're pumping lots and lots of money and it's going into high fine art, high-end cars, trophy properties across all the key markets, jewels and gems, fine art and things like that. If we're seeing explosions in prices in those, that's definitely inflation, but it tells us where the money's going in the story. So that's the part in the story that the second piece of the transmission mechanism that's missing is they pumped a lot of money in the system, but it went to a fraction of 1%. And that fraction of 1% is spending as fast as they know how on the stuff they care about, and so we see plenty of inflation. The question is, will we see general inflation across the population? Here's where we get confusing stuff again. So we're seeing very high food inflation right now, if you want to call it that, but what we're seeing is price rises. There's a big difference between food inflation caused because there's more money in the system, causing people to have more earning and bargaining power, causing wages to go up, causing prices to go up. What we're seeing is we had a big drought, so cattle are kind of hard to come by. That's a supply issue. We're seeing high energy costs feed into the food system. That's a reflection of high energy costs, and that's a reflection of oil becoming more expensive. It's not inflation, right? So we're seeing lots of signs of stress in the food system that are coming from environmental factors and energy factors have more explanatory power than inflation, right? But the Fed theoretically would be happy if they saw all of our general prices go up 2%. Mission accomplished? The answer is no.
Only if wages went up, and only if when hiring went up. And we're not seeing either of those two things. Now Yellen has come out and said she wants to focus on hiring. I don't know. To me, the Fed cannot create jobs, period. The Fed can destroy jobs, but they can't create. The only way the Fed could create jobs is to get out of the way and disband themselves, which is highly unlikely, to say the least.
Yes, to say the least. Will we see general inflation? The linchpin in all this for me is so I don't like to put too much on events, but they capture my attention because the cornice has so much snow on it. I'm always wondering, like, what's the footfall at the edge that's going to make it fall. So I look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, and it's generally a large battle between East and West. And East in this story includes Russia and China seeming to pile up with each other. This story took on urgency a full year ago in March when Russia and China inked a deal for natural gas. Russia supplies 30% of the natural gas to all of Europe, particularly Germany consumes quite a lot of that. They only have about 6.5 trillion cubic feet per year for export. They inked a deal with China where China is going to take fully half of that over the next 10 years. Russia they can't increase their production. They've got it not that fast. So Europe started to look at that and said, this is not good. Well, how are we going to start to secure our supplies of this? So one lens we have to look through in the Ukrainian situation is that's the transit pipelines for a lot of the Russian gas coming through. Plus, theoretically, there might be some shale gas there that people are salivating over. But the story in the Ukraine can't be understood without the energy lens being applied over it at this point in time. And so if we got into some sort of, if the squabble gets worse with Russia, and Russia suddenly says, that's it, You know, imagine like World War II, if something like that happened again, Russia wasn't going to export any energy to anybody under that scenario. They are the #2 exporter of oil in the world. They account for fully 20% of all the oil that covers the globe on an export basis. If that got cut off, prices of oil would just absolutely spike in a really sharp way.
And worldwide depression or recession.
All the data shows that there's two things about oil. When oil prices go up, but go up at a high rate, that always triggers recessions. Like that's every time in the series. If they bleed up slowly, you can avoid it. But sharp hikes in energy costs are a shock to the system that are highly 100% correlated with recessions at this point when they happen. So at least over the last 30 years or so. So if we saw an energy spike in prices because of conflicts, that would be one of those events I would look at and say, this would cause me to make very, very big changes in how I operate in terms of where my money is, what my investments are, what I might do in terms of purchases and whatnot. Because I don't think our system can stand a shock like that at this point. It still feels weak. Feels like they've papered it over, but it's not fixed by any measure at this point.
Okay, well, both you guys have recommended precious metals, and I'm assuming really at the end of the day it's because of concern over the currency. Like you mentioned it, Chris, I know you've said that before. If not, clarify, but just precious metals had a bit of a difficult time the past 2 years.
You've certainly been wrong on that.
Still a big endorser, and what do you think of the state of the precious metals market right now?
I guess it's a question of what you define as wrong. But certainly I wouldn't have expected the stock market to take off and for everyone to believe, and this is what it's all about actually. It's belief that the Fed has everything in control. And if everything's in control, well, then you don't need gold. You know, the money supply is current, interest rates are going to be low, GDP is going to go up. This is what caused the price of gold actually to climb from 800 to 250 in 1980 and 2000. It was the belief that everything was under control. All of a sudden in 2000 we say, oh, things aren't in control. Now here we are, we've gone through 2 more crises in 7 years. And everyone's back to believing that the Fed and central bankers have everything in control. So I don't think they do. I think that they're going to taper it. I don't think they're going to get to the point where they're hiking. And what's going to be the beneficiary of that the next time? I would have thought gold would already be benefiting from that, but I failed to predict the bubble belief in the Fed, which I think is one of the biggest bubbles.
Precious metals, that means gold and silver. And people ask me that often with one word, and with 2 separate words to it. Silver I love because it's depleting rapidly. In 15 years, all known surface deposits that are mined specifically as operating mines are exhausted. It'll still be part of base metal production, but we're probably going to be seeing a perpetual decline of gold. And it's awesome. If you love your operating rooms bacteria-free, you love silver. It's being woven into clothes, it's being put in paints, it's on bearings, it's fantastic. It's the most reflective element, it's the most conductive on the periodic table. So industrially, love it. And from a supply standpoint. Gold is not something I held because of inflation concerns. It correlates terribly with inflation, actually. Surprisingly. I have it as insurance against a financial accident. It correlates wonderfully with financial uncertainty, particularly if there's institutional uncertainty. It's the only monetary asset that's not simultaneously somebody else's liability, which means it has, if there's tier 1 assets, this is tier 0. And it's really good stuff. So I believe there's another financial accident in the weighting I hold gold. It's an insurance policy on that. But a friend of mine who just constructs model portfolios just for fun and does it religiously has proven to me beyond a doubt that a 20% weighting in gold across the last 90 years that covers inflation, deflation, wars, periods where it was clamped and maintained is an ideal weighting for a risk-adjusted return if you want an efficient portfolio. It's right on the horizon. So a higher weighting for gold than any financial firm that I know is recommending actually is provably is an efficient weighting in the model portfolio.
Yeah, so most of the recommendations are what? 2%, 5%. Actually, a lot of people.
I think most don't recommend
0%.
Minus 2%. Depends.
All right, well, thank you guys. We're going to take 5 minutes to just get some fresh air and a cookie, and we'll come back in.